Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Elite City Podcast. A little serious note here before we get started. Just want to throw a little warning out there. We're going to be talking about the Vince McMahon situation, so a lot of sensitive type subjects. We'll be talking about sexual assault and stuff like that. So if you don't want to hear that, you feel free to turn it off. Skip this episode. We're not going to go in super deep, but it is going to deal with sensitive subjects. So on that note, we have guest friend of the show, Mr. Paul, and as always, Mr. Rick. So how are you guys doing?
I'm doing good. It's funny, maybe not funny. I guested on another friend's podcast, and it was on as a Murder, She Wrote podcast, and it was the most problematic episode of Murder, She Wrote. So I'm having kind of deja vu that I'm here for, not to make light of this, but I just had a weird sensation of
without going into significant detail. What is the most problematic episode of Murder, She Wrote?
So
it's when Angela leaves Cabot Cove.
It is not. It's a Cabot Cove episode called Indian Giver, where
that already sounds bad.
Yeah. Basically I'm blanking on the name of the tribe, but a descendant of one of the Mohawk tribes claims that he owns Cabot Cove, and it's played by a South Asian actor instead of a First Nations person.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of usage of anti-Native American slurs, and yeah, so transitioning from that to Vince McMahon.
Here we go.
Here we go.
This is already not an enjoyable episode. What were we expecting when we did that? Yeah, we honestly, when all this stuff came out, I didn't want to talk about it at all. Like, I read everything,
right?
But I didn't want to talk about it because it's bad. Like, it's horrible. Not that I didn't want to talk about it because I don't want it to exist, or I don't want to think about it. It's bad, and I don't like. This is a podcast. We try to have a good time,
right?
So I didn't want it, but like, it is important for wrestling and for generally society for these things to be known and talked about. So we kind of have to talk about it, but we're going to try to talk about it in like a what this means for wrestling aspect.
Yes.
Angle, not so much like, I don't want to go into details because it's if you've read it, you recognize it, that it's disturbing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to talk about what it means for like the wrestling industry. Obviously that's less important than what it means for like the individuals involved.
Here's the first question. When the news broke, honestly, were you surprised?
I was surprised at the level of how bad it was. All of us and most long-term wrestling fans assumed that Vince McMahon was not a great guy, but the specific details of it were worse than I imagined them to be, personally.
See, I thought the same, and I always on the podcast I've brought up my buddies from high school who we grew up watching the Attitude Era, and they're long lapsed wrestling fans, and my buddy Ross was 100% like, I asked him how his dog was doing. He was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. I could have seen that coming from a mile away. And it was just like, really, like, and not that I'm involved with WWE, but like, I'm still kind of semi-involved, whereas he's totally removed. And he was like, dude, he was a horrible, horrible human. And I'm like, I know, but I'm kind of surprised. But it's weird how it totally just didn't blindside anybody, if we're being serious.
Yeah, for me, it's the same thing, and I'm not sure what to do with that information. I feel slightly guilty in an odd way that I've kind of supported this horrible human being for years, and again, as you both said, it was sort of it was sort of an open secret. We knew how bad Vince McMahon was. I don't think we knew how bad.
Right.
But Josh, kind of echoing what you're saying, like I've been thinking about the jokes and the story angles that I remember from the Attitude Era and after that. And I can't unsee the abject horror. Because because I feel like that was like a sort of Freudian acknowledgement of somebody's own sick depravity. And
I mean, especially when you hear stuff from like the stuff that has come out that Ashley Mazzaro said, that like basically if you rejected his advances, he basically wrote you into more upsetting, insulting, degrading angles. That was how he responded to that. And then you think of all the stuff that came out in the Attitude Era and like the Ruthless Aggression Era, which was possibly worse in terms of him doing horrible things to people on TV. And it was just, you just think of all of those angles. You're like, oh, were those just angles? Like, is that TV, or was that him, trying to get back at people?
And now the Ruthless Aggression Era, that's like when I was checked out. But as you're saying that, like, people, you can't forget, like, we can all sit here and be like, oh, why don't you just quit? Well, during that time, you went from making a lot of money to zero. There was literally nowhere else to work.
Right.
So
that you could have any television exposure or make a living, unless you wanted to go on beyond. Even indies weren't
right then.
In 2005, there wasn't even that many viable indie promotions for you to go to.
Yeah. So it's like, again,
and I'm sure he knew that. Like
exactly. I mean, it all comes down to the power trip. Like, not only is it used to get what he wants, but it's held over everybody's head. Like, you weren't going to make that kind of money, not just the women or the men or the TV production, or like, you weren't going to make that anywhere in that industry. So, and he knew that. Like, that's the sick part. Like, everybody was under his thumb at any minute, and he could just make an example out of you and did not care.
And when you mention anybody, like, obviously the sexual, the assault charges were like probably the worst of the things that he's done. But he also, made people work hurt. He made people work injured. He made people, put their lives and their livelihoods on the line because he wanted them to be in the ring. And if you didn't listen to him, you just didn't wrestle. Like, it goes beyond. I think this potentially could go beyond, like, the incidences that we've heard of so far. That's what I'm trying to say.
I'm glad you brought up the injury thing. Just on a side note, I've been following this like pretty hard, and a lot of the like older generation wrestlers have been speaking out on like podcasts, and I don't want to name who it was, but I'll tell you guys privately. But he said on his podcast that, again, we always talk about, especially with you here, Paul, we always talk about WWE controlling the narrative. Well, once the territories were gone, the whole like working hurt and working through this, not every territory was like that. That was spun. Yeah. That was spun by Vince to have people believe that that's what the industry was like. So you have that whole mentality and that group working for that person who, well, of course, if everybody does it and you're going to, like, I don't want to say weed out the weak, but if a majority is going to do it, that's going to be the standard. So they also realize, well, the territories are gone. Well, that's what I got to do. So the whole working hurt and being a tough guy and all that stems from his psychotic in real life being like a workout fanatic. And like, he probably never took a day off. Like, if he had the stomach flu, like, he's just that insane.
It is. Yeah. It is this like Ayn Randian weed out the weak, hyper capitalist ideology that he has, and yeah, there's something to be said for like playing through pain when you're an athlete, but there's unions and everything. We'll get to that later. But No, like, again, like, that's kind of like pulling everything together. That's the controlling of the narrative, and that's the power that this man has had over the pro wrestling industry in the United States for the last 30 years. And two, like, and then also like some of Vince's like quote unquote quirks that have been reported in WWE documentaries and, like, you know, in other media, as these quirky quirks are just another side of like people, you can't sneeze in front of him was the thing I always heard. And this megalomaniac, and I guess like we can get to this at the end, but like it's really made me just I've had these points as a wrestling fan where I have to like take a step back and really evaluate my passion, my interest with it. It's one of those kind of seminal moments for me that I'm having a really hard time processing.
And I think it's because like both of you have said, it's not just like a company in terms of wrestling, because they've for a vast majority of our lives have been like either the dominant company or the only company. They have got to not only set the rules for everybody else, but you're right, they've kind of crafted what wrestling is. They've told the fans, they've told the wrestlers, they've told everybody what the wrestling industry is supposed to be like.
Yeah.
So if they decide this is how the wrestling industry is, then not to I don't name any specifics, I don't know anything here, but if a bunch of guys left WWE and started their own wrestling company, I'm not saying they would be insane to the point of Vince McMahon, but aspects of that company would be similar to WWE, because that's wrestling currently. That's what wrestling is. That he's kind of made it that all of wrestling is what he wanted. So if you're going to be in wrestling in any capacity, he has some sort of influence over, even if you're not watching them, even if you're watching every other company but his company, he still has influence over what wrestling is, you know, today and in the past. And that's disturbing.
Well, that. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I maybe I'm just kind of parroting what Rick said, but I was just thinking here, like, you know, in the territory days, like each territory has relatively distinct style of what wrestling looked like. And, you know, again, the other thing that I always seem to bring up when I'm on the show is, well, the wrestlers need to protect themselves. And if you've aesthetically established this is what wrestling is, then the only thing you can do to kind of make your mark on the indies is do things that you don't see in WWE, but it's not going to stand out unless you're doing something high risk, which they don't do typically in WWE. So even that, like, you know, because like if you're not a wrestling fan and you watch wrestling, the odds are the only thing you're going to watch is WWE. And and then also just like what a star looks like. And then, yeah, like, how do you treat your employees? Well, it has to be this way, because that's what Vince does, or I should say did. And yeah, sorry, I cut you off, Josh.
Well, no, there was. I was just going to segue into, like, that's where the automatic AEW hate comes from. And when Rick was talking, it reminded me of, I'll never forget, like, when I was in college and there was like the big tech boom, and like there were no dress codes and like all this, and like I just remember like the Fortune 500 like old heads were like, you can't run a company without wearing a suit and blah blah blah, and these tech companies, those people won't be here. Well, here we are 25 years later, and like the Facebook guys, is that not Zetterberg, that's a hockey player, Zuckerberg is a billionaire. Like, you know, and he didn't wear a suit because they were just had it out for him. It's like almost the same parallel. AEW gives healthcare and gives you time off, and you don't always have to be on TV, and your spot will be held for you. And it's a team. It's not the next person up. Well, that's not the way it's done, so they're going to fail. Like that parallel is it just dawned on me right now. And that's kind of what it's like you said, Paul. It's like Vince's way or no way to even a fan.
So I don't know the answer to this. Do any of you, when you were just talking about, AEW, do either of you know, like, when did this quote unquote independent contractor thing start, where you're not actually an independent contractor? Because I mean, in long days gone by, they were legitimately independent contractors, going from company to company and wrestling where they wanted to wrestle and doing basically what they wanted to do. When did it basically come to the point where you're an employee, you work for one company, you do what that company says, but for classification purposes, you're an independent contractor?
Didn't that start when Dallas Page tried to unionize when Vince bought WCW?
I feel like it was before that.
Yeah, if memory serves, right, like it was when Vince took over the WWE, and he started going on the national, like, monopolization campaign that he did.
Okay.
But I might be wrong, but there are traces of it even going back to the NWA in limiting what a wrestler could do in terms of like wrestlers doing their own promotions. Like, that's where you have like the outlaw promotion starting. Is like, you're not approved by the NWA.
Right.
So yeah, I think there are traces of, like, even going back to the 40s.
Because I feel like that's one of the significant problems in wrestling, is that when you're an employee, you have rights, right? You have benefits, you have time off, you have whatever. When you're a contractor, you don't have those rights, but your right is that you can be more flexible. You can work for you basically work when and where you want.
Right.
But wrestling kind of has the best of both worlds for the company, where you can only work for that company and you have to work the way they want you to and when they want you to and where they want you to, but you still have no benefits.
And that's what's frustrating, is like, if you look at the National Labor Relations Board definition of independent contractor versus employee, there's maybe some minor details that you could classify a pro wrestler as an independent contractor, but the wrestling company provides the service. The wrestling company is dependent on the labor of the workers. The wrestling company controls your persona. It controls when you work, controls your merchandising. The WWE was, a couple years ago, was controlling wrestlers' Switch accounts. And
right, telling them that they couldn't do other activities outside of,
yeah,
like they couldn't have a online stream anywhere.
Right. And if you're limiting basically someone's moonlighting activity, that's an employee.
Right.
So it's very frustrating. There hasn't been like a national shift toward, at least in the United States, and I presume Canada is the same way, of recognizing these guys as employees, these guys and women. And it's unconscionable to me, like, how this has been allowed to go on for so long.
I totally agree, but it's that double-edged sword. I'm gonna put the correlation to the tattoo industry. My best friend's a tattoo artist, and being paid in cash is the greatest thing in the world, in which that would all stop if there would be a union. And you would see, honestly, how much these guys and girls made, and the starving independent wrestler might not be a basket you could go to all the time, That's the only thing. But it would make
I feel
level
like
playing field.
But if you're an actual independent contractor, then you're an actual independent contractor. If you're on the indies right now and you get to decide, I want to do a show in Boston this weekend, and next weekend I want to be in Detroit.
Well,
next
that's
weekend,
true too.
Then that's you're a legitimate independent contractor at that point, right? So that's different than someone who works for WWE, because in WWE, like, yeah, they own your name, they own your private time, they own your image, they own like I work freelance, and if someone tells me I need this done Friday, I can say no. And they may not want to work with me if I say no, but I can, as part of the employment I have with them. Whereas if you're an employee and they say, I want you to come in Friday, and you say no, you're just fired, right? Like that's how that works.
Unless you have a union.
But unless you have a union. Yeah. And I mean, we've been skirting around this for a really long time. And obviously that's an issue in wrestling.
Yeah.
Is the union aspect of it. And it's always been a problem that like the top guys don't want the union because they're doing great. And the lower guys either don't have the pull to form the union, or they're too scared because they're lower card guys. They're worried that they could get cut loose easily.
And that's all American propaganda propagated to you by people that have never been in a union. I'm not going to swear. That's just that's what everybody spews, but that's the exact opposite of how a union works. There would be a pay scale. They'd figure out look at baseball. Like they sign $100 million worth of contracts.
Yeah. I mean, every other professional athlete that in a professional league is in a union.
So it would be the same thing. Like there would be like the, Fuego del Sol would not make what Cody Rhodes makes, but there would be levels to, people know who Fuego is. He wrestled here. He had this contract. He's on tier 2. I don't know, say there's 5. It would be drawn up. But that's unfortunate that people in our country think that way because corporate greed. Sorry.
No, and
that's a great point.
Yeah, it's totally a great point, and wrestlers know it's happened,
right?
Rick Wilson in the 80s, 70s or 80s in Georgia. I don't know if he was working for, I don't know if he was working for the NWA at that point, or what was the direct forerunner to WCW in
World Class,
Georgia Championship Wrestling.
Georgia Championship Wrestling. I think he sued the NWA for being like a cartel, and they blackballed him. Allegedly that's why Raven got fired from WWE.
Right, I've heard that.
In the second run, I think. And of course, like Hulk Hogan narking on.
Right.
Oh God.
Jesse Ventura?
Jesse Ventura, thank you.
Yeah,
I was having a brain fart there. And not Jesse Ventura didn't get blackballed, but he was in Vince's doghouse for a few years. So
yeah, didn't they edit him off of all the videos for a while?
They did. They
edited his commentary out of a bunch of things for that.
I couldn't imagine. I'm laughing because I couldn't imagine being that petty.
I mean, that was a significant problem in wrestling for a very long time. And it seems like we're straying from the Vince McMahon allegations, but I think this is all a part.
That all comes from Vince. Yeah, that's all the control.
This is the culture that he created. That if you don't do what he says you're going to do, you don't exist. Right? There are wrestlers who he decided don't exist, essentially. Right? That they will just write them out of history. They will write them out of whatever, and they just don't exist because they didn't listen to him. And I guess that's kind of the irony of this situation, because now that looks like is going to happen to him.
Well, that's my first point that I wanted to bring up to you guys. He has talked about legacy from, the time I was a child, did like WrestleMania 2. Well, his legacy's gone as far as pretty much everybody is considered. If
you even noticed that they released a trailer for the new WWE video game, W2K24, and the Vince McMahon welcome to WrestleMania thing. It's Triple H now.
See,
they're already getting rid of him, which I'm not saying they shouldn't. They definitely should. Okay, but yeah.
Well, here's my question. This looks like it's leading to federal charges, which looks like, the feds don't take a case unless it's pretty much a slam dunk. So that could change. But that being said, if Janelle Grant goes through with this, it looks like she's going to be a part of till the end, she could totally step in and say, anytime I hear the name McMahon, that gives what's it called when you, post-traumatic stress syndrome. She's like, it gives me PTSD when I hear the name McMahon. I want all of that scrubbed from there. Not just his face, but the name and Stephanie and Shane. Like, if she would do that, WWE would not exist for 40 years. There would be the TKO WWE, and then there'd be the WWF. Like, she could literally do that, and she has every right to do that, and I hope she does. But imagine the weight of that.
Yeah, I saw someone point out, did TKO in, not the people who are in UFC or the people who are associated with WWE before, like, did the big wig investors at TKO who don't care about wrestling or anything, like, they're there to make money,
right?
Did they know the ins and outs of wrestling and the extent of Vince McMahon's involvement in the on-screen product when they got in? Because they listed him as a potential liability for the company.
Right.
That would make the company look bad. Did they recognize what that meant? Like, how ingrained in this company he was
Probably
when they
not
became a part of this? Or was it just, oh, this company makes a bunch of money, I want to own it?
I would say I would lean towards them not doing their homework, because, I mean, you're going to do your homework to an extent, because, I mean, there would just be you'd have to wait for a merger like that to go through with the federal government. But like you said, Rick, they're just looking at the bottom line. They probably had a big chart in front of them, and the one that was the biggest said, oh, what's that say? WWE, let's buy that.
Like, yeah, and I mean, I'm sure they knew that Vince McMahon was a powerful force.
Oh, yeah.
They likely knew that he had an on-screen character, but I want to think, did they know like that? No. If you watch anything from WWE from 1995 till 2015, he's all over it all the time.
Before that, he did commentary throughout the 80s.
Right.
That's what I mean. Like,
he's like all
40
over
years
the product, like all over every aspect of it.
Like, I can't imagine that they wouldn't. Right? Like, I'm thinking, companies
they almost have to.
Yeah, like, I know companies don't do due diligence sometimes, but he was so ingrained with the product, and you don't have to do like a cursory search or cursory history to see, one, like, just how involved he was, and two, also going back to the idea of liability, right? He, the federal trial in the 1990s. At the very least, right? So, but I'm still thinking about Josh's question about how this affects the kind of, the legacy moving forward, for lack of a better word.
I mean, they have been very good at they remain very good at controlling narratives. Like I said, they can make people disappear. Like, oh, Demolition, you ever hear about them? No, of course not.
No,
right?
But they're easy to get rid of. Like, I mean, Vince
can they actually get rid? Like, who was Austin feuding with for all those years?
Right,
McMahon, right? Like,
right. I mean, that's the thing. Like, when you think about that, like, it's like when they had to go back and blur all the WWF out from the World Wildlife Foundation. That got, it was kind of funny, but it got hard to watch after a while. But not blurring it out, but like, if they would just cut him out of everything, like, shows wouldn't even make sense.
Yeah, I mean, they've removed problematic segments from shows. Like, they taken out DX's skit.
Right.
They took out like Roddy Piper at WrestleMania one time when he, but you can't edit Vince McMahon out of 40 years of WWF footage.
I think they might have to just do a disclaimer. Like you see on
like the Chris Benoit stuff.
Yeah, or like I was actually thinking, like, sometimes you'll see this on Turner Classic Movies where they have a film from like the 30s or 40s that has very derogatory portrayals of Black Americans, and you just have like, hey, we condone. We don't condone. Sorry, the actions of Vince McMahon. I could. That might be. That's a weird thing, but
I feel like they'd have to do it. I mean, some programs that have to do it for the entire program, right? Like, there's episodes from the 20, 30 years ago that are just uncomfortable to watch outside of Vince McMahon.
But that's what I'm saying. The things that he's doing and what he's accused of are
very connected. Yes.
Yeah. It's not he was like an in-ring talent as the Crusher. and then his real life Vince McMahon was this. Like, no.
Yeah, the things he did on TV are very similar to the things he's accused of doing in real life. Yeah.
And that's like, if you edit that, like, is it even worth editing out? Do you just, is there just a, like, like it exists, but do you erase the digital footprint of it? That's what I was trying to
or could you like there's levels of it, right? Because I mean, yes, Vince McMahon being on television in any capacity can be obviously traumatic for people who he's done horrible things to. But there are levels of Vince McMahon on commentary from 1985 versus Vince McMahon, degrading Trish Stratus on TV, right? Like they're all Vince McMahon, but he's not doing the same thing. Like, but it's different, but it's still him. It's difficult. It's definitely difficult.
It is, and that's what I mean. Her case and the Fed's case, I mean, it's been corroborated that the text messages came from his phone. Like, that was on the same podcast that I referenced earlier. So with that now being, I mean, obviously she had them like screen capped and whatnot, and she could prove that she had his number, but them knowing that they came from his phone now, it's a pretty solid case. And again, I understand anything can happen, but I'm not going to apologize. I want to see him fall flat on his face and then have a truck back over him.
Yeah.
Like,
but I mean, like, outside of Vince McMahon's like 80 years old or 78 years old or whatever he is, right? Like, outside of the punishment for Vince McMahon, which obviously he should be punished if found guilty, and I don't see how he wouldn't be. Like that's the basic point of this podcast. Like, what does this mean for wrestling overall, right? Because like he's wrestling to a lot of people, right? Like he's wrestling. And like, I mean, Bret Hart talked about it, and he said, oh, he's like Jeffrey Dahmer, or he's like Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein. Like, yes, he's going to be considered a vile person that you can't speak highly of on the same level of any of those people. But none of them were, I mean, maybe Harvey Weinstein, but none of them were an entire genre to themselves.
Right. Like other production companies made movies.
Yes.
Not, like, yeah. But I understand what you're saying. Like, it is weird that like there is wrestling, but it's like, oh, you either wrestle in a fire hall or in an arena. And like, it's.
I mean, they purposely crafted that. I mean, they had Triple H, years ago to say that, oh, before Vince McMahon came around, wrestling was in the back of smoky bars. Like, no, like, obviously it wasn't. There was wrestling at massive stadiums 50 years ago, right? But that's the narrative that they've crafted, and now that's generally what everyone believes. So how do you have wrestling?
Well,
and just forget about Vince McMahon, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, but like, how does it function?
I'm glad I'm going to ask you guys a question. This is question number 2 for you. Do you think we come full circle and this is the beginning of a new version of the territories? Like, WWE has their flag cemented in the ground. They don't want anything to do with quote unquote pro wrestling. That's their sports entertainment. They're going to be a brand that's entertainment based and sponsor based, and we know that. But like AEW and New Japan and CMLL and GCW, and I mean, are we seeing a revival of the indies on a bigger scale?
Yes, but also like WWE is so big. There's never been a wrestling company that's this big, and they are a wrestling company whether they want to be one or not. So like, if AEW or TNA or whoever was hugely successful, there's literally nothing stopping them from going, oh, you're 10 most which they've done in the past. Oh, you're 10 most popular wrestlers. As soon as their contract runs out, we're going to give them $1 billion so they come wrestle for us. Like, that's entire. Like, they could do that and have done that. So it's hard.
But they have that stigma now. Who wants to go work for a sex offender? I'm just saying.
If you
you have options now.
I get what you're saying, but I mean, what they're going to try to do is say, "Oh, he's gone now. That was the problem," which it wasn't, but that's what they're going to try to do. And for a lot of people, that'll be okay, and for other people, it won't feel great, but they're going to give you exposure and money that you wouldn't get anywhere else.
But you have other options now. Like see, you're going back to the Vince thing. You don't need the internet exists now. You are your exposure.
Yeah, if they give you, they can give you more money than anyone else can give you, and they can give you 2 million people on television a week, which no one else at this point can.
I mean, I guess, but I'd rather have less money work where I wanted to and have, excuse my pun, control my own narrative.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely there's a lot of people that will choose that. I mean, we've seen from, the recent free agent signings that a lot of people have made that choice, right?
Right.
Okada and Jay White and Will Ospreay and Mercedes Moné have all seemingly made that choice. And I just think at any point, if they wanted to, like if WWE wanted to, and they were like, oh, TNA is getting too big, they could just buy TNA if they wanted to, right? Like they could and have in the past just exerted their control over an industry.
But again, they necessarily can't do that anymore because that would be a lateral merger, and they are a Fortune 500 publicly traded company. That those days of doing that are like, you can't do that unless you could prove that is not a lateral movement, that you're just buying it because like, oh, that would improve our business.
I mean, in the who was that lawsuit? MLW, I think. MLW sued them because they alleged that WWE tried to get them kicked off of their streaming deal because it's associated with Fox or I forget who, a network that WWE is affiliated with. And basically WWE in their argument said that we're not a monopoly because, AEW exists. And that was their first, acknowledgement of AEW existing as competition. And it was only because they had to say that it exists legally. They have to say they have competition. So like, because AEW exists, they can say they're not a monopoly and they can, as long as they don't buy AEW.
Yeah, but I don't know. Them buying a company that was only worth a few $1 million. I mean, I don't know if the government would let that happen.
I just think they'll try to exert their control.
And I don't. You're 100% right. They will. They'll have to do it different ways.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here thinking, and I'll tell you what, I would love for the territories to come back. I have gotten way more old school in how I think about this in the last 10 years or so. But like, I'm trying to envision a way for some semblance of the territories to come back. And if it happens, like, let's say like AEW continues and TNA continues, and there's more inroads made by New Japan, and some more cross promotion from CMML and AAA in Mexico, or maybe like a territory of visibility might be the way to think of it, and I would be totally happy with that.
Oh yeah,
but I don't know. The WWE is such a behemoth, and my worry is that in a lot of cases, how am I saying this? I think pro wrestling has niched itself so badly since 2001 that there aren't many ball games in town. And it's not like other things where there are scandals and with this might be a bad comparison with Weinstein, right? You can go very easily to a different film company and watch their product.
Right.
And with the WWE, like with wrestling, I'm not sure, it's becoming increasingly harder to get access to the content in the same way. Even though like there has been, like TNA is going to have like some thing on the CW, like online or something. You have AEW. You can find New Japan stuff, but it's just like it's just different enough. It's just different enough from every other entertainment in the United States and Canada that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I understand. I understand without you saying any more exactly what you're saying.
I mean, is it to the point where it's like other sports leagues? Like you can't compete with the NFL. You can't start a sports league and that will rival the NFL. It's impossible at this point. You can't do it. Is it similar to that? Like, yes, there will be other sports leagues. There's other leagues that play football, but none of them will ever be anywhere like the NFL is football for a lot of people. Is wrestling the same? Like WWE is wrestling for the vast majority of people.
I think that's a great analogy. Is as much as you would think that competition for the NFL would be a good thing, every time a pro league, and it's only a pro league, which is weird. Like you could turn on ESPN during college football season and literally see like Bowling Green play Eastern Kentucky State.
Right.
And it's like, oh, that's just football. I'll watch it. But as soon as you put the word pro in front of it, it's like, oh, nope, the NFL is the best. And it's that trope. Like the NFL controls that narrative and all the pro leagues control. Like, wow, that makes a lot of sense.
It reminds me of like the territory days. Like when Vince McMahon went out and bought TV on other that was right. That was previously another territory's TV slot. Yes, he was doing that to expand his own company, but he was also doing that to take away that company, right? Like he didn't have to buy their TV slot. He could have got another TV slot, right? But he didn't want that. He wanted to take their TV slot so that he could not only expand his exposure, but also hurt the other company. And yeah, you can't do that now because there's TV contracts, things work differently. But I don't know, just having to, it seems so impossible to actually compete with them on a level that's viable, because as soon as you get anywhere close, they will do something. And yes, you're right. They can't, because of their size, they can't do certain things because they're so large, but they can, do quiet things. They can, like we've talked about before, like their deals with arenas, they could just decide you can't go to certain arenas. Like they will do anything to hinder you. And I feel like there's such a massive conglomerate right now that if AEW ever got close, if say the ratings were close, right? Like Raw was getting 2 million and AEW was getting 1.8 million. Like they would have ways of, we're going to hurt you just a little bit. We're going to make it show you, oh, your big show, we can't have that. Like, didn't New Japan have a show planned for Madison Square Garden like 5 years ago? And they shut that down. Like they're still so powerful that like, if you get close to them and they feel threatened, they can hurt you. And it's just, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know what this means for, because it is different. They're a different company. There's a different landscape. There's Vince McMahon's not in charge, and a lot of the crazy behavior that the company did was a reflection of his craziness.
Well, and this is another point that I wanted to bring up. Did WWE officially now paint itself into a corner if the Endeavor Group, we know they're not going to, but for, just because they're different, if they wanted to extend the olive branch out to New Japan and AAA, AEW, I'm pretty sure they'd get a bunch of middle fingers in their face.
Yeah, just because of their history. But, well, first of all, because of their image currently, but also their history. Like, yeah, you don't.
Right. So, like, that's why I said before, they're going to distance themselves even further from wrestling. WWE is going to turn. I don't want to say variety show, but like I just saw a thing on YouTube today. The opening segment of Raw was a 17.5-minute promo followed by a 5-minute commercial break. Now I know they have a 3-hour show, but think about the explosion that the internet would have if Dynamite opened with a 17.5-minute promo and then went on a 5-minute commercial break.
I mean, there's always that's always been their thing, right? Like they've always done that. They've always had less wrestling. Like Vince McMahon himself didn't want to be associated with wrestling, even though he if you've heard biographies, like there was that Behind the Bastards podcast of how Vince legitimately loved wrestling as a young person, right?
Yeah.
Like he legitimately loved it. Like he was interested in it. He wanted to do it. He legitimately loved it. And then he went out of his way to distance himself from it. And the company continues to do that. It just, I don't know. I find wrestling is so weird. We've talked about how wrestling is so weird a whole bunch of times. But like Disney exists as a company, right?
Uh-huh.
And they make movies and they make cartoons. And like DreamWorks is a separate one. They don't own them, right? Like DreamWorks or Warner Brothers makes movies and cartoons. And like, yes, Disney obviously wants to make more successful movies than either of those companies, but they're not going out of their way to like destroy them.
Right.
In the capacity that like Vince McMahon's WWE would. Like he wasn't fine with just being more successful.
And that goes to his insanity. You know,
yeah. So I mean, they may be completely different now because he's not there, right? Like they might not care. Like most movie studios don't care that other movie studios exist. They might not care because it doesn't matter.
And after you said that, like, just think of that. Like, I wouldn't want to be in his head for 12 seconds. Like that you could be that petty and that it would bother you that much just because something existed.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this a bunch before, and it seems weird to talk about on a relatively serious podcast. But like when Sting finally went to WWE after not going to WWE for so long, they made a point of saying he's representing WCW and then embarrassed him.
Right.
Like, that was 18 years or something after. Like, you don't need to do that. WCW lost. You won, you bought them, and there's no need for 18 years later to go, by the way, we're better. Yeah, obviously you were more successful. Like, you don't need to tell people that. It's weird. And now that he's gone, maybe you're right. Maybe they won't try. Maybe they won't care because they don't like that's not how regular companies work. So maybe they won't do that anymore. Maybe they won't throw their weight around and try to run everyone else out of business because they're not run by a crazy person anymore. I don't know.
Well, like I said, like it is off. Well, he's not as awful as Vince, but Dana White's a pretty terrible person too.
Yeah.
But he at least had the forethought, like when he would fire guys, he would make sure that they would have a job with pride. Like not all the time, but he basically acknowledged that, okay, there's the number 2 company. You didn't cut it here. I'll put a word in for you there. So with Dana being semi-involved, not saying that, you know, that's how they're going to run it, but maybe they will be more open to.
Vince McMahon was definitely a special level of vindictive.
Oh, yeah.
Vindictive to a level that most business people aren't.
And, I mean, look what it got him.
Yeah, I mean, it worked. You can't say it like, yeah, he was successful doing this, but now it's weird to, I don't know. I'm having a problem even thinking of, like, it's weird because they've been so ingrained into it that it's hard to even think of professional wrestling, even though they claim they're not professional wrestling. It's hard to think of professional wrestling without him in it at this point, right? Like and that's not to say that I want to see him in any capacity. I don't.
Right.
But it is weird to think about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I think he is 1000%. Like, there's, again, excuse the pun, there's no chance of him ever coming back or even starting something else. Like, of course, the internet was saying, oh, all he'll do is start another company. No. Like,
if he doesn't get convicted of this, if somehow he doesn't get convicted of any of this, he's still done as a public figure.
As a public figure, he is ruined. Yes.
So what does wrestling look like without Vince McMahon in it?
Man, that's a question. I'm trying to think of a parallel right? Like I mentioned before, like it's name a person in an industry that has taken a fall like this, and what's that industry? And I'm struggling to think of one.
I mean, the only person who I can think of who was so ingrained with their company, not that they had a fall like this, but who was so ingrained with their companies and their image and how they acted, was Steve Jobs with Apple. He was just so a part of that brand.
Yeah.
Obviously, he didn't have a downfall like this in any capacity, but like it was hard to think of Apple without Steve Jobs. And but that was just Apple. I mean, there's still computers without Steve Jobs, or there's still phones without Steve. So it's that's not even necessarily that's a comparable for his company, but not the size of the company.
Right. So I don't know. Like, I think we're in kind of uncharted territory here. And you can point to, I'm just thinking through my head, like very problematic, terrible people at the heads of companies that are still around, like Henry Ford, and I'm sure there are others. I was just thinking Henry Ford for some reason, or God, I went dark here, but like, the German companies that were supplying the Nazis with arms and equipment, and like those companies still exist. I'm not saying that these are necessarily comparable, but for an entertainment company, I'm really struggling to think of one that is so ingrained with like a Steve Jobs level figurehead, not even figurehead, but like public face. I don't know. This is up to wrestling, I guess. Is in some ways what McMahon did with the WWF and the WWE is not that different than what the guys were doing with the NWA in the 40s, like running a cartel, screwing people over you didn't like.
I was thinking that when we were talking about sorry to cut you off. I was thinking when we were talking about like the possible resurgence of the territories. And in the territories, it's not like it was all sunshine and rainbows. Like there still was there still was an overarching force. Like is that just destined to? There's always going to be some overarching controlling force in pro wrestling that it's just smells.
Yeah. So maybe if this one figure is out, and then there can be a capacity for wrestling to be different. And if wrestling acknowledges its crimes of the past, and there are many, not just McMahon.
Absolutely.
Then maybe there's possibility here. But I'm also thinking about the last the last 200 years of world history, and I'm not also optimistic either. Like I just have to be Debbie Downer and everything. I mean,
that is a good point, that there is, like, outside of McMahon, wrestling obviously has its own set of pretty significant issues, like the portrayal of certain people, how wrestlers are treated. Like I saw a thing that Dax Harwood was talking about, how he loved working in AEW because one of the things they do is they have a bus that drives you from the hotel to the arena, and I'm like, why is that a perk? Right, like that seems like that should just be a thing that they do, right? Like that's bizarre that he's like, I don't know how long he's been wrestling, but like the fact that that's the first time that's happened to him.
Yeah, it's so odd. Like
if you're a professional sports team, like obviously they do that. Like why would you not do that for your wrestlers, right? Like it's
not up to Sidney Crosby to jump in the car with Malkin and 6 other guys and drive to Montreal because they have a game tomorrow night.
And I don't even think that's, I don't know this for certain, but I don't think that's unique to WWE, WWF. Like I'm sure WCW, I'm pretty sure WCW did the same thing, and every other company kind of did the same thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Like AEW going out of their way for people is like, people can't comprehend it in that industry because Tony Khan comes from pro sports where you take care of your talent.
Unless you're CM Punk at a subway station in England.
Yeah, true. Or you're the Jacksonville Jaguars just in general. But
True.
Maybe let's not use that example anymore.
That's true. That's true.
But like I know we're AEW watchers and fans, and I don't want to sound like AEW is perfect because like they still have independent contractors. They still don't necessarily give people health care. Yes, they give them time off and they give them, basic human dignity in many capacities, but like they're not perfect. They're not
right.
There's certainly things that AEW can be doing better and should be doing better. You're right, Paul. It's kind of up to wrestling. Are they going to decide to be better now that Vince McMahon's no longer involved, or is wrestling just going to decide like, no, this has been working. We're just going to keep doing it until someone tells us we can't.
It's the old guard, and as soon as it's time for the old guard to get pushed out nowadays, the old guard's gone. The people younger than millennials, who whatever they're called, and I don't know because I'm old. Them people taking over, they're doing a hell of a job, and they're not putting up with. Well, that's how it was. Well, that's not how it's going to be.
Agreed. That's true.
Gen Z.
There it is.
That's it. They seem to be doing a good job.
Yeah, when my niece and nephew tell me how people like live and work today, it's such a breath of fresh air. Like my I won't get into it on here, but they're a great generation.
They treat each other and themselves like with respect, which is yeah.
And they don't care about the tropes that our parents scared the hell out of us for. Like my niece she's a school teacher and was just talking about like she knows people that will just like walk out on the job because it was like unfair, or someone got an unfair promotion. They're just like, oh, sorry, I'm done. And I'll find something else.
Does wrestling survive that then? I mean, obviously they're massively successful, WWE in particular. But you're right, the culture is moved away from a lot of the things that wrestling has traditionally done, and the practices of wrestling.
It's evolve or get run over, because that's the way Gen Z. I learned something. That's the way they look at it. They're not going to put up with excuse my language, with our bullshit. Like there's not an excuse, because we always came up with an excuse, and that generation is tired of, well, we can't do this. Why? Because like, no, we're not doing it anymore. That's it. And I think this, just as you said, they treat each other with like, it's like respect. Like you think you would treat everybody with respect, but like they don't care who you are, what color you are, who you like, who you date. They don't care. And as everybody shouldn't. But that generation, they got it on lockdown, and they're not going to put up with things like this. If that's what wrestling would choose to stay that way, they would say, well, then get it off my television. You know,
I think them moving to Netflix will be a big deal. Not necessarily obviously in a positive way potentially, but it will be a massive change, because the audience of Netflix and the audience of cable are not necessarily the same, and the ease of just watching something else on Netflix, right? Like if you start an episode of Raw and it's bad and you don't like it, you just close it and then click to another show. So
true.
I don't know. I think that's I had not thought about that, but I think that's a really good point. Like, and I'm sitting here thinking, teaching Gen Z and younger, right? Like they are more socially conscious, but their viewing habits, and I teach film a lot, and one of the hard things is sitting students down to watch a film, and they're like, what do you mean? I can't do that. And so
do you play a clip of like a cell phone game below the film?
I might have to start doing that. I'm not kidding.
And it has to be vertical.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't understand that at all.
Yeah, it's like the cell phone. That's
I know. I
gotcha.
I don't understand the thought process.
Yeah.
Sorry to derail your point here.
No. But it's like viewing habits are radically different for people, and I think other leagues have sort of adapted to it a lot better than the WWE and wrestling in general. And so if you're going on a streaming service, right, that's access to younger people and also other people too that have kind of cut the cord from cable. And now you're like directly, because how many people have Netflix? I think it's more people than have cable in the United States.
It is.
So that's more awareness and more access, and it's also on a platform that, like the WWE, is trying to destroy everything else around it. So there's a kind of synergy there.
But I mean, Netflix has. I mean, when everyone talks about the ratings, right? The ratings are based on a couple thousand Nielsen boxes, and they extrapolate that over the the population of America. So it's supposed to be a representative sample, but it's not accurate. Mm-hmm. Right, but Netflix is accurate. They know specifically how many people watch every show, and I've read things about Netflix. Like they know when they I don't know if they still make any of their own shows, but when they were making their own shows, they know, oh, this show aired for 10 episodes, but 55% of the audience stopped after episode 3. Why did they stop after episode 3? Oh, there was a certain scene in episode 3 or a certain character in episode 3 that people didn't like, so then they stopped. Like they have that.
Analytics.
They have that level of detail into people's viewing habits. And I mean, if wrestling is on and they decide, oh, most people out of a 3-hour Raw stop watching after 1 hour and 27 minutes, are they going to do something? Or, oh, people don't, when a match gets too long, they turn it off. When a promo gets too long, they turn it off. When this person's on, they turn it off. Like they'll have that information.
Yeah.
Which no one else has had at this point.
I
know it seems like a different conversation, but.
No, I think it's this. I think it's part of the same conversation because, like, it's going to if this continues, it's going to force wrestling to change, right? Like, we all talk about the ratings and the drops in matches, like on a Dynamite, and the booking has to change, right? It's like I don't know if either of you watched Barry on HBO, but there's a great scene in Barry where one of the characters has a show on like a Netflix, and it's released and it's like #1 on the website, and the next day it's off, and she meets with this is kind of spoiler heavy for season 3, but but she meets with like the people from the network, and they're like, yeah, the algorithms proved like your show isn't working. And she's like, well, how is that possible? And because Netflix is really good at this, right? Like they know to the minute, right, when something's not working. And if you've given X amount of money, X amount of billions in dollars to a company, and you're like, hey, yeah, this isn't working, they'll change. So I like that. I like this idea.
I mean, that alone could force them to change, even if they don't want to change. Like they could be forced to change because they have to.
And it's not like that, like they've run roughshod over USA for what, 20, 30, 40 years. And what else is there?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. It's going to be very interesting because this is all happening at the same time, right? Like Vince McMahon. First of all, Vince McMahon not being directly involved in the company is in itself a big deal. Then, like if he was just gone, like say there was no scandal and he just left wrestling, like he just retired and left, that would have been in itself a big deal.
Right.
And then the way that he is leaving and the effect that it's going to have on not only himself, but the industry and other people who work for that company and other companies. And then the Netflix deal coming at the same time. And yeah, it's going to potentially be a drastic change. And because they're so huge, like if it's a drastic change for WWE, it's a drastic change for basically every other wrestling company.
Yeah. That's a great point. Does anybody else have any other points before we go?
I mean, we just have to say AEW should have never hired Ric Flair. Just again,
we could.
Ooh, yeah. Oh boy.
Well, because it's one thing to say we're a different company and we do different things, and they do, and Ric Flair is not in charge of the company, and Ric Flair is not the head of the company, and Ric Flair is not, as far as we know, doing things to the extent of Vince McMahon doing things. But it kind of undercuts your point every time you say we're different, but we still perfectly fine with working with this guy.
I was just happy they kept him off television once all this broke.
I agree.
I mean, I understand, like, they did sign the contract with his energy drink. So if you notice, it's not on the screen like all the time. They must have like segments sponsored by it,
right?
Because it's like on and off throughout the night.
I feel like their deal probably stipulates it has to be on for like a certain percentage of the show or something.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I was happy that he wasn't there. Even though
I do feel like if this Vince stuff had come out earlier, they would not have hired Ric Flair.
I 100% agree with that.
Well, but it's also Ric Flair, and you know, like, how do I want to say this? Like, you know, Ric Flair, you know, the decades of allegations, right? Like, come on, right? Like, Tony, I like you, but you've made these statements that you're not doing the same thing, and then you hire Ric Flair before all this other stuff comes out. Yeah. I think you've kind of already lost any moral high ground. Anyway, so wrestling is the worst. I don't know. It's just really.
I don't know why I like it, but I really like it. I really, really like it. And then I just like, but it's so bad, but I like it. Like it's it's a whole thing.
Oh,
it
My
is.
grandmother got me watching it. She was a wonderful lady, but she got me watching this, and I feel like that was both a great thing and an awful thing because I love wrestling, but also I could have just never watched it.
As my dad ruined me.
It was my neighbor, my dad, my uncle. They're all at fault. So,
Yeah. So
but I enjoy it, but I hate it. It's a thing.
But that's I think it's true for everything for me.
I was just
honestly.
Say.
Yeah, that's true. Like I'll watch hockey and be like, hockey's kind of stupid, but then I still watch. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a sport being run by billionaires who are funding anti-LGBTQ plus initiatives throughout the world. But oh God, the Flyers, the playoffs, I'm a very happy man. I just like stuff that you have to repress just like for happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. it's you just take the good with the bad, I guess. That's a great. Yeah. It's a great way to end it, honestly. Just take the good with the bad. Thank you.
Hope for the best. Hope that it gets better.
Yeah, hope for the best. Absolutely. Paul, thank you. It was a fun show. Good time. Rick, thank you, as always. Everybody, make sure to like, subscribe, share at Elite City Pod everywhere.
We'll have some good AEW stuff next week. Don't worry.
Yes. Back to the regular scheduled programming, as they say. Any final words, anyone?
Vince McMahon is a terrible human being, and buy my book. I guess I got to do a plug.
There you
go. Plug yourself. Go for it.
Yeah. Buy All Play No Work from Temple University Press, so I can be happy.
There you go.
Sure.
And I feel like you're right. I feel like we haven't stressed enough that Vince McMahon is a terrible human being because
yeah,
awful.
I think it can't be stressed enough. Like it needs to be constantly be stressed.
Yeah.
I always hashtag justice for Janelle Grant anytime WWE posts something. So it's my response.
Good work.
Yeah, fuck them. Anyways, on that note, later.